So there's a fascinating article in the New York Times I want to talk about titled Why White Supremacists Are Chugging Milk, which is a weird title. And here's what they say. Nowhere on the agenda of the annual meeting of the American Society of Human Genetics being held in San Diego this week is a topic plaguing many of its members, the recurring appropriation of the field's research in the name of white supremacy. Sticking your neck out on political issues is difficult, said Jennifer Wagner, a bioethicist who had sought to convene a panel on the racist misuse of genetics and found little traction. They also worry about how new tools that are allowing them to home in on the genetic basis of hot-button traits like intelligence will be misconstrued to fit racist ideologies. This is an argument that I have on a pretty frequent basis with a friend of mine, Jane Costin, over at Vox. Jane is black and I think rightly has great sensitivity. I think everybody should have great sensitivity, but I think Jane would suggest that her background contributes to the sensitivity with regard to the racist past of the United States and the racist association between politics and bad science. And so this has led to some serious conversations between the two of us about political correctness, about whether, in fact, there's an appropriate time to talk about IQ, for example, or standardized testing, for example, or about natural differences between men and women. Like, when can you talk about biology without being condemned as a sexist or a racist? These are real issues that we have to discuss and take on head on. Unfortunately, the scientific community has decided to quash a lot of actual science because they're afraid that people who are racists are going to take that science out of context and then use that to club into submission a minority group. And that's basically what this New York Times article is about. It says, in recent months, some scientists have spotted distortions of their own academic papers in far-right internet forums. Others have fielded confused queries about claims of white superiority wrapped in the jargon of human genetics. Misconceptions about how genes factor into America's stark racial disparities have surfaced in the nation's increasingly heated arguments over school achievement gaps, immigration, and policing. Instead of long-discounted proxies like skull circumference and family pedigrees, today's proponents of racial hierarchy are making their case by misinterpreting research on the human genome itself. The scientists whose job it is to mine humanity's genetic variations for the collective good are grappling with how to respond. Now, here's the real way to respond to all of this. Put out the science and then defend the science. That's the way to respond to all of this. Instead, the scientists, afraid that their science is going to be misappropriated, misinterpreted, or used for bad reasons, they have decided that they are going to simply quash all of this discussion internally. John November is a University of Chicago evolutionary biologist. He says studying human genetic diversity is easier in a society where diversity is clearly valued and celebrated. Right now, that is very much on my mind. One slide Dr. November has folded into his recent talks depicts a group of white nationalists chugging milk at a 2017 gathering to draw attention to a genetic trait known to be more common in white people than others, the ability to digest lactose as adults. It also shows a social media post from an account called Enter the Milk Zone. In most of the world, the article explains, the gene that allows for the digestion of lactose switches off after childhood. But with the arrival of the first cattle herders in Europe some 5,000 years ago, a chance mutation that left it turned on provided enough of a nutritional leg up that nearly all of those who survived eventually carried it. And then the post shows a snippet of hate speech urging individuals of African ancestry to leave America, saying if you can't drink milk, you have to go back. Well, so what? So what? So they're idiots. One of the great ironies of white supremacists is they're the stupidest people on the planet. They're constantly talking about how white people are superior, and they're just dumbasses. That's one of the things that's so funny. It's like, if you're going to proclaim white superiority, then you really should send your best. Okay, the white supremacists are not sending their best. They're sending idiots. And they're like, oh yeah, white people, better than everybody else. Also, I scored 1,100 on my SATs. Okay, so, in a commentary that accompanied the paper in the journal Genetics, Dr. November warned that research is wrapped in numerous caveats that are likely to get lost in translations. Because people are flaunting DNA ancestry tests, indicating exclusively European heritage. But the problem here is that we actually have to look at what science does have to say, because it is a confounding factor when you look at attributing racism to America. So take, for example, racial disparities in education. So there's a lot of talk these days about affirmative action and whether people are performing at certain levels eligible to get them into college. And the suggestion is that it is historic American racism that has led to the education gap in America's higher education system. Well, an alternative would be that the test scores do not line up equally among various ethnic groups, right? They just don't. And that's true not just with regard to black and white. It's not true with regard to white and Asian. White people score lower on the SATs than Asian people do, as a general matter in the United States. How much of that is genetic? How much of that happens to be environmental? We don't actually know the answer to that. That's a hotly fraught question in science. But suggesting that racism is to blame for everything without looking at other confounding factors, like, for example, test scores, is a mistake and leads us to the wrong outcomes and leads us to the wrong measures to deal with those outcomes. Genetics is not the answer to all of these disparities, but neither is racism. Now, these are questions we have to be very careful about, because obviously you don't want to give material to people who are suggesting that some people are inherently worse or more evil or more violent or stupider because of the color of their skin. Genetics doesn't line up that way, but you also have to look at questions of science because you are a scientist. So it is fascinating to watch this debate play out in real time. There are doctors who have organized meetings of social scientists to discuss the social implications of the field's newest tools. David Nelson, a Baylor College of Medicine geneticist, says it will not stay completely quiet on the issue. They said there is no genetic evidence to support any racist ideology, which is true because racism is a moral view and genetics is a scientific view. And scientific racism is the use of science in order to be racist. It is not the use of science in order to pursue good ends. So if you're silencing research because you're afraid of how people are going to use that research, then I would suggest that you're misusing science, and we need to have some very hard conversations about actual science, actual problems, and actual solutions without falling prey to the idea that because bad people are going to misuse the information, we have to quash the information itself.